The first time James Crawford saw her, she was bleeding onto the trading post floor and daring anyone in the room to say a word about it. He had come into Haverson's post the way he came into most places, quietly, with his hat pulled low and his eyes doing the work his mouth rarely bothered with. It was late autumn in the Greywood Frontier, that particular shade of cold that had not yet committed to winter but had already said its goodbyes to warmth. The trading post smelled of tallow candles, cured hides, and the faint copper bite of something recent and unkind. A half-dozen men stood scattered near the walls and the shelves of dry goods, and every single one of them was looking at the same place. She stood at the counter tall, green-skinned, with tusks that curved upward from her lower jaw in two clean ivory arcs. Her hair was dark as creek-bottom mud and pulled back with a leather cord. She wore a frontier woman's practical coat, worn at the elbows, over a rough spun shirt that was darker on the left side than it should have been. She had one hand pressed flat against her ribs. The other was laid open on the counter in front of old Haverson, who was staring at the coin she had placed there like it might turn into something dangerous if he looked away. "I need bandaging cloth," she said. Her voice was even, not asking, and a jar of pine pitch salve. Haverson's jaw worked without producing words. "I have coin," she said again, and her green eyes moved once, briefly, across the room cataloging threat. James realized, the way you cataloged it when you had learned to always expect it. She was bleeding, standing in front of a man who would not serve her, in a room full of men who would not help her, and her face carried the absolute composure of someone who had stopped being surprised by this a very long time ago. James Crawford set his own list on the nearest barrel and walked to the counter. He did not do it quickly. He did not make a show of it. He simply walked to the counter, reached over Haverson's frozen arm, took a bolt of clean linen from the shelf behind the man, set it next to her coin, and then reached for the pine pitch salve on the second shelf and set that down too. "That should cover it," he said to Haverson in the same tone he used to discuss lumber prices. The room was very quiet. "I can pay," she said to James, and there was a warning in it, not a hostile one, but the kind that came from pride that had been stepped on too many times to risk any more weight on it. "I know you can," he said. "I saw the coin." He looked at Haverson. "You going to take her money or not?" Haverson took the money. James picked up his own list and went back to his barrel. He did not look at her again that day. He told himself that was a courtesy, not a cowardice, that she did not need to feel watched on top of everything else. He heard her footsteps leave the post. He heard the door close. He heard one of the men near the wall make a low comment that he chose not to dignify. He collected his own dry goods, paid for them without speaking to anyone, and walked out into the gray afternoon. She was 20 feet up the road, standing in the thin shelter of a pine's overhang, struggling one-handed to wrap the linen around her own ribs. The angle was wrong. Her fingers were going stiff with cold. He stopped. He knew better than to approach without warning. He knew the way a wounded thing could turn dangerous not from malice but from fear. And he recognized in her posture the coiled readiness of someone who expected every approach to be an assault. "If you hold still," he said from where he was standing, "I could tie that off properly. I know how. I've patched myself up enough times to know the knots." She looked at him across the 20 feet of cold road. Her eyes were the deep green of summer pine boughs, and they were reading him with a precision that he found, unexpectedly, not uncomfortable. He had been read like that before by horses mostly, and occasionally by people who had survived enough to get good at it. "Why?" she said. "Because it'll hold better," he said, "and because you're losing more blood standing here arguing about it than you would if you let me do it." A long pause. "Don't touch anywhere you don't need to," she said. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said, and walked forward. Her name was Snaga Frostwolf. He learned it the way you learned most things on the frontier, not all at once, but in pieces, offered cautiously, taken with equal care. She told him her name when he asked it, standing under the pine with her coat held open and his hands working the linen bandage over the wound at her ribs. He did not ask about the wound. He did not ask how it had happened. He tied the knot, stepped back, and told her it should hold until she got somewhere warm. "I'm heading north," she said. "The old Merker homestead, above the creek." He knew the place. Abandoned 2 seasons running, with its roof half in and its chimney stones scattered. Not a place anyone went on purpose. He decided not to say that. "Good road north until the birch line," he said. "After that it's rough going." "I know," she said. She pulled her coat closed, pocketed the salve, and walked north. James watched her go for a moment, then went east, toward his own land, and told himself that was the end of it. It was not the end of it, because 3 days later he was running his trap lines along the creek that ran between his eastern boundary and the old Merker property, and he found a snare set in the willows that was not his. It was a decent snare, properly anchored, good loop, well placed for the rabbit runs along the bank. He recognized the construction. He had, after all, spent 3 minutes of his life watching the same hands tie a bandage knot. He left the snare alone. He left his own line and walked home and did not think about it. 2 days after that, he found a second snare, and then a third, and then a small lean-to blind built against the creek bank with what looked like salvaged timber from the Merker barn. Someone was working the land. Someone was, against all probability, in a Greywood winter trying to live out there. He chewed on that for a week. When the first real snow came, a serious, committed snow, not the flirting kind, he loaded his pack sled with a second winter's worth of dried provisions that he had set aside against the possibility of needing to barter, added a bundle of good roof shingles he'd been storing in the barn, and walked north. The Merker homestead was less terrible than he'd expected, which meant it was still fairly terrible. She had done remarkable work with limited material. The chimney had been remortared imperfectly, but usefully, and the roof's worst gap had been patched with pine bark and oilcloth, and what appeared to be the better part of a wool blanket. Smoke was coming from the chimney in the thin, careful way of someone conserving fuel. The door, which had been hanging from one hinge the last time he'd passed this way, had been rehung and fitted with a crossbar. He stopped 20 feet from the door and said, in a carrying voice that went toward the house and not toward the tree line where he'd already seen the shadow move when he'd come up the road, "It's James Crawford. I have roof shingles and provisions. I'm not here for anything else." Silence. Then the door opened. She looked better than she had outside Haverson's post. The wound at her ribs was healing, he could tell by the way she moved, cautiously but with less of that tightly controlled stillness that spoke of pain being managed. She had exchanged the blood-stained coat for a heavier one that was too large for her and had the look of something traded for or found rather than bought new. Her dark hair was loose today, falling past her shoulders. She was watching him with those precise green eyes. She looked at the sled. "I don't accept charity," she said. "Good," he said. "This is a trade. I want to run my trap line along the East Creek bank. Your snares are occupying the best section of it. I'm proposing we split the line and split the take." He watched her work that around. "Those are shingles," she said. "Roof's going to fail under a heavy snow," he said. "If it does, you lose everything you've stored inside and you're sleeping in the cold. My trap line isn't worth much if my partner freezes before the season's out." "I'm not your partner," she said, but the word had landed somewhere and they both knew it. "You will be," he said, "if you want to eat through to spring." Another pause. "Leave the shingles by the barn," she said. "Come in if you want. There's tea." He pulled the sled to the barn wall and left it there and went in. The inside of the Merker cabin was spare and clean and organized with a soldier's economy. Every surface that could hold something useful was holding something useful. Herbs drying from the rafters, pelts stretched on frames, a row of clay jars along the windowsill. The fire was modest and precisely tended, not a flame wasted. She had set a kettle on the iron hook over the coals and it was already starting to hum. He sat in the chair she indicated, which was the one away from the fire, he noticed. The better chair, the one closer to the warmth, was hers by right of it being her house, and he respected that. They drank tea. Pine needle and dried rosehip with a thin scrape of honey. Outside, the snow was deepening against the walls. She did not tell him about her wound. He did not tell her about the 3 months he had spent unable to sleep before he'd come to the Greywood Frontier, or the reason why. They talked about the trap line and the creek's winter habits and the best way to patch pine bark shingles so the ice wouldn't get underneath them. And when he left 2 hours later, the terms of their arrangement were settled. He was back the following week with the tools to fix the roof properly. It took them 3 days to do it, working in cold that crystallized their breath and made the nails hard to handle. He worked the ridge line, and she worked the lower courses because she had, as it turned out, a head for heights and a contempt for caution that he had to argue against twice when she tried to walk the peak without a rope. They argued about it in the practical way of people who have more important things to do than nurse wounded pride. And she tied the rope, and they finished the roof. And when they came down for the last time, the sun was setting, and the Merker cabin's roof was solid enough to laugh at a Greywood winter. They ate inside by the fire that night, dried venison and hard bread and more of the pine needle tea, and she told him, unexpectedly and without apparent reason, that she had come from a clan territory 200 miles southeast through the Ashwood Pass on foot. He said nothing. She said, "I'm not going back." He said, "All right." She looked at him sharply, the way people looked when they expected an argument and had been bracing for it. "You're not going to ask why," she said. "No," he said. That seemed to settle something between them, though he could not have said precisely what. He went home that night and lay in his bunk in his own cabin, which was well built and warm and utterly quiet, and stared at the ceiling for a while before he slept. James Crawford's cabin sat on 40 acres of the best bottom land in that section of the Greywood. He had built it himself over 2 years, driven by the specific focused industry of a man who is working very hard not to think. The logs were notched tight and chinked with clay and horsehair. The roof was good cedar shake. He had a barn that could hold 4 horses and a cow, and currently held 2 horses and the cow, and a quantity of hay sufficient to last until the frost broke. He had a root cellar and a spring house and a kitchen garden that in summer produced more than he could eat alone. He had come from a town called Ashfield, in the lowlands south of the Greywood, where he had been a deputy to the town's marshal for 4 years. He had been good at the work. He had been good at most of the things the work required: the presence of authority, the physical competence, the ability to stand between trouble and the people it was aimed at. He had not been good at surviving the night his partner, a man named Rel Hollies, who had been his best friend for 6 of his 26 years of life, had been killed in a situation that James had been responsible for managing and had managed incorrectly. He had never told anyone that. He had simply left Ashfield, come north, bought 40 acres of Greywood bottom land and started building. He was 28 now. He had a good roof and a tight barn and a root cellar full of winter stores, and a silence inside him that sat where grief and guilt preferred to live, and that he had furnished so carefully over 2 years that it almost felt like peace. Almost. He and Snaga ran the trap line through December and January, meeting at the creek split 3 times a week. They divided the work without ceremony and shared the proceeds with the same practical fairness. She was a better skinner than he was, faster, cleaner, with a precise economy of motion that he observed and gradually improved his own technique against. He was a better tracker of the deeper ground, knowing the land east of the creek the way you knew a thing you'd watched change through every season. She knew the Merker land's quirks, the sinkholes, the hidden springs, the boggy patches that froze deceptively over the low ground. They talked while they worked. Not about themselves, not at first. About the land, the animals, the weather, the small crises and adjustments of winter survival. He told her the creek would flood in late March, always, and she told him the birch stand on the north slope was dying of something, and they should take the good wood before the spring softened it to uselessness. He noticed she had gathered medicinal herbs with the kind of specific, organized knowledge that spoke of training rather than casual learning. She noticed he moved through the woods with the particular awareness of a man who had once been responsible for other people's safety. Neither of them commented on what they had noticed. In February, he came to the trap line 3 days in a row and she was not there. He worked his half and left hers and did not think about it. And then on the fourth day she was not there again, and he put his tools down and walked to the Merker cabin. She was sick. Not dangerously, not the kind of frontier sickness that ended badly, a chest cold that had gone deep and was making her stubborn body work too hard. She was upright, which he suspected was entirely a matter of will rather than comfort, tending a pot of something herbal over the fire with the fixed concentration of a person who will not admit they should be lying down. "Sit down," he said from the doorway. "I'm fine," she said. "You're not," he said. "Sit down." She sat down, and the fact that she did it without argument told him more about how she was feeling than any words would have. He came in, closed the door, took over the pot, and spent the next several hours doing the quiet work of tending broth, hot water, more fuel on the fire, the blanket he fetched from her sleeping area in the loft because she had, with characteristic stubbornness, not pulled it down herself. She watched him from the chair with those green eyes that missed nothing. "You don't have to do this," she said. "I know," he said. "Most people wouldn't," she said, and there was something in it that was not quite bitterness, more like the flat observation of someone who has taken accurate inventory of the world. He handed her the broth and sat in the other chair and said, "Most people aren't your business partner." She almost smiled. He catalogued that, the way he was beginning to catalog all of her small, rare expressions, storing them against the general silence between them. "I've been told," she said around the edge of the mug, "that I'm difficult to be around." "By whom?" "By most people I've been around," she said. He considered that. "I find you easy to work with," he said honestly. "You're efficient and you don't waste time talking about things that don't matter." "Is that a compliment?" "It's the truth," he said. "Same thing when I say it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she drank her broth and did not say anything else, which, he was learning, was one of the ways she expressed something close to satisfaction. He stayed until she slept in the chair. She refused the loft. He didn't fight her about it. And then he stoked the fire, pulled the blanket up over her shoulders, and walked home in the dark. The scars were something he noticed without intending to notice them. The first one he was aware of was the one at her ribs. He had touched it, after all, the day they met, and through the linen he had felt the ridged topography of old damage underneath the new. When she worked in the cold without her coat, rolling her sleeves past her forearms to set a snare, he saw the ones on her arms, not the random marks of an active life, but patterned, deliberate things that spoke a language he did not know and did not ask to learn. There was one that ran from the corner of her jaw down the side of her neck, half hidden by her hair, that he had seen only once, when she'd had her hair tied up to keep it from the fire while they worked. She had not hidden it. She had not offered it. She had simply been herself, with the scars as part of herself, and he had looked at it for 1 second and then looked at the fire and asked her whether she thought the creek would freeze hard enough to support the weight of the sled. She had answered. They had moved on. He understood, in some place below words, that not asking was not indifference but respect, that some things were a person's own, and to demand the story behind them was to insist that the damage be explained and justified before it was allowed to exist. He had his own things he did not explain. March came with the creek flood he had promised her, and they spent 2 days moving her stored goods from the low floor of the Merker cabin to the loft and the barn, working in cold rain with their boots soaking, and the creek roaring 30 yards from the door. When the water retreated, it left a thin gray silt over the cabin floor and the lower garden beds, and they spent 3 more days putting things right. It was during the cleanup that she said, unexpectedly, while she was sweeping silt into a pile near the door, "I was a healer, in my clan." He was hauling a crate back from the barn and he stopped in the doorway. "The herbs," he said. "Yes," she kept sweeping. 12 years of training. I was the youngest full healer they had graduated in 2 generations. She said it not with pride but with the precision of someone reciting a fact about a person who no longer existed. And then there was a dispute, political. I was on the wrong side of it by association, not by choice, but the distinction stopped mattering after a while. He set the crate down. "You left," he said. "I was removed," she said, and the word was flat and final. "From my position. From the healer's hall, from the clan record. I walked out before they decided I needed to be removed more permanently." He looked at her. She was still sweeping, her back to him, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. "How long ago?" he said. 14 months, she said. "You walked 200 miles through the Ashwood Pass in winter," he said. It was not a question. "The pass was closed officially," she said. "I found a way through." He picked up the crate again. "You kept the knowledge," he said. "The healing." "Yes," a pause. "It is mine, not the clan's. They can remove me from the record, but they cannot remove what is inside my head." He brought the crate to its place and said nothing for a while. He was thinking about what it meant to lose a life you had built and had to start from nothing in the cold, and about how much courage that required, and about the fact that she had done it without apparent drama or self-pity or any expectation of sympathy. "The Greywood needs healers," he said finally. She was quiet for a moment. "I know," she said. "The settlement at Millhaven, 12 miles west, they have a sick caller who is mostly a barber with opinions," he said. "And the homesteads between here and there have nobody." She looked at him over her shoulder. "You're suggesting I set up practice," she said. "I'm noting the need," he said. "What you do about it is your own business." She turned back to her sweeping, but he saw her look at the row of herb jars along the windowsill, and the look she gave them was different than before. Spring opened up the Greywood like a letter, unfolded slow, then all at once. The creek subsided, the mud firmed, the birch trees came out in their small, insistent green. James expanded his kitchen garden and started the work of breaking new ground on the south field that he had been meaning to do since the first year and never got to. Snaga re-established the Merker kitchen garden and took 2 loads of cut birch from the dying stand before the wood softened. They saw each other 3 or 4 times a week now. The trap line was largely done for the season, but the habit of proximity had developed its own momentum. He came to help with heavy work she needed a second pair of hands for. She came to help when he needed a second pair of hands, or, on one memorable occasion, when his horse kicked up a fuss and threw a shoe, and injured her own foot in the process, and the only one in a 10-mile radius who could deal with an injured hoof was the woman with 12 years of healing training who turned out to apply her knowledge to animals with equal competence as humans. The horse, whose name was Dunn, took to Snaga with the specific betrayal of an animal that has decided its loyalties lie where the most knowledgeable hands are. He found this mildly undignified, and she found it mildly funny, and the combination produced a warmth between them that had no name yet but had begun to feel inevitable. He began to notice things about her that had nothing to do with competence. The way she stood outside in the early morning to watch the sun come through the trees, still and unhurried, as though she had a private agreement with daybreak. The way she could identify a bird by its call from 100 yards off and murmur the name under her breath without being aware she was doing it. The way her hands moved when she was working with her herbs, methodical and precise, but also tender, the way you moved a thing you genuinely valued. The tusks that he had first seen as intimidating and now saw only as part of her face, the way the line of her jaw and the angle of her cheekbones and the deep green of her eyes were part of her face. The scar that curved from her jaw to her neck that he still did not ask about, and that she still did not explain. He was also noticing, and this was a more complicated observation, that the silences inside him were changing in quality. They had been empty for 2 years, those silences, furnished with nothing but the echo of what he refused to think about. Now they contained something, not noise, not the busy, effortful chatter of a man pretending to be fine, something quieter than that and more honest, something that had been sitting there long enough to have put down roots. He didn't know what to do with that, so for a while he did nothing. In May, she went to Millhaven. She did not tell him she was going. They had not reached the place in their relationship, whatever it was, where movements required reporting. He found out because he rode through Millhaven on his way to the grain merchant, and saw her wagon outside the barbershop caller's premises. And when he came back 2 hours later, the wagon was still there, and a woman with a bandaged hand was coming out of the door looking considerably more comfortable than when she'd gone in. He stopped his horse and waited. She came out eventually, carrying her healer's bag, which was a battered leather satchel that smelled of pine pitch and dried yarrow, and something sharp and clean he could never identify. She saw him and stopped. "The barber has gout and a bad temper and no interest in being challenged," she said. "He made his position on my presence clear." "What did you do?" James said. "I treated the woman with the hand injury while he was making his position clear," she said, "and the boy with the fever who was sitting in the yard because the barber told him he would have to wait until he'd finished making his position clear." He looked at her. "And then," he said. "And then I said that I had treated 2 patients in the time it took him to complete one opinion, and that if he had further opinions, he could address them to me on a day when I was not busy." She settled her bag on the wagon seat. "He will either adapt or he won't." James looked down the main street of Millhaven at its dozen buildings and its permanent mud and its people who had come out onto their porches to watch. Some of them were watching with curiosity, 1 or 2 with hostility, but one woman, the one with the bandaged hand, was watching Snaga with an expression that had nothing in it but relief. "You need a place in Millhaven," James said. "Somewhere people can find you." "I have the Merker cabin," she said. "Which is 12 miles from town," he said, "and 12 miles from most of the homesteads you'd be serving." She looked at him with the precise, careful look. "You're suggesting something," she said. "There's a building next to the cooper's shop that's been empty for 2 years, he said. "Haverson owns it. He might rent it for a fair price." "Haverson," she said, with the specific flatness of someone revisiting a particular memory. "He took your money the second time," James said. "He'll do business if the terms are clear." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't have enough to front a rent," she said, and the admission cost her something. He could see it in the slight tightening of her jaw. She was not a woman who found it easy to acknowledge limitation. "I do," he said. "James, there was a warning in it." "It's a loan," he said immediately, "against future proceeds." Same terms as the trap line. "I'm not giving you anything. I'm investing in the only healer in a 50-mile radius, which is a sensible investment for a man who occasionally does things that require patching up." She looked at him for a long time. "You do occasionally do things that require patching up," she said finally. "Constantly," he said. "It's practically a business necessity," she said. "Half the first 6 months' proceeds go to the loan. Third," he said, "you need to eat." "Half," she said. "Third," he said, and held out his hand. She looked at the hand, she looked at him. And then she took his hand and shook it, and for the second time he catalogued one of her small, rare expressions. This one something close to gratitude, worn briefly, and then put away before it could become a vulnerability. The healer's building in Millhaven was small and smelled of old wood and mouse, and a previous occupant's dubious cooking history. They spent a weekend cleaning it and fitting it out, James doing the structural work, a missing board replaced, and a window rehung, while Snaga organized her herbs and tools with the same soldier's economy she had applied to the Merker cabin. He built her a set of shelves which he had always been good at, though he'd had no occasion to build them for anyone other than himself in 2 years. When the shelves were done, she ran her hand along the top one, testing its level, checking the joints. Then she looked at him and said, "These are very good." "I know," he said, and she laughed. He had not heard her laugh before. Not fully, he had heard the precursors to it, the dry edge of her humor, the almost smile. But this was a laugh, brief and genuine and entirely unguarded, and it hit him somewhere in the chest with a force he was not prepared for. He turned back to his tools so she would not see the expression on his face. The healer's practice grew through the summer with the quiet inevitability of a thing meeting a genuine need. People came, cautiously at first, the way they came to anything new or different or unsettling, and then with the particular directness of people in pain, because pain is a great eliminator of prejudice. A child with a broken arm was brought by its desperate mother with no concern for the healer's species. A farmer with an infected wound came because he was running out of time to be selective. Word moved the way Frontier word always moved, in concentric circles of trust, person to person, one relieved family to one worried neighbor. Not everyone came. There were people in Millhaven and in the surrounding homesteads who would not cross her threshold on principle, and she did not spend energy on them. James, who came into Millhaven regularly on various errands, noted the ones who made a point of crossing to the other side of the street when she passed, and noted them in the private ledger he kept of things that were his business to pay attention to. There was one man, a big, loud homesteader named Deverick Crane, who had come to the Greywood from the same lowland country James had, who made a habit of public commentary whenever Snaga was visible in the street. Nothing violent, kept always just on the presentable side of ugliness, but the kind of persistent, low-grade nastiness that was designed to erode rather than confront. James spoke to him about it once, in private, in the particular quiet voice he had developed as a deputy and never quite lost. And while that conversation produced no miracles, it produced a notable reduction in the volume of Deverick Crane's public observations, which was sufficient for the present. Snaga found out about the conversation 3 weeks later. He didn't know how. She had her ways, and she came to his cabin one evening, unannounced, which was unusual enough that he looked up from his work with a wariness he could not entirely suppress. "You spoke to Crane," she said from the doorway. "Yes," he said. "I didn't ask you to," she said. "No," he said. "You didn't." She was quiet for a moment. He put down the tool he'd been using and turned to face her properly, because she deserved the full attention. "I can manage Crane," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I didn't do it because I thought you couldn't. I did it because I was tired of listening to him, and because I knew that if you handled it, you'd do it in a way that would probably cost you 2 patients, and I didn't want that for your practice." She looked at him steadily. "And because," he said, after a moment, in a different tone, careful and honest, "it bothered me, more than it should have, probably." The evening light was coming through the cabin door behind her, catching the edges of her, the dark hair, the green skin, the curve of her jaw where the scar began its line. She was looking at him with that precise, reading look, and what she was reading this time was something he had not exactly offered her access to. He waited. "It bothers me too," she said very quietly. "That it bothers you, I don't know what to do with that." "I don't either," he said honestly. She stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said, "I brought bread. From the baker's wife she gave me a loaf in exchange for the fever medicine. I can't eat it all." "Come in," he said. They sat at his table and ate bread with the dried berry preserve he'd put up in autumn, and outside the Greywood evening came down in its long, slow, golden gray way, and they really talked, for the first time without the frame of work or practicality. About small things. About what they had liked once before the things that had made them come north. About the places they had seen. About what the Greywood looked like in different seasons. About nothing important and everything important, the way conversation worked when the walls had been tested enough times that people began to believe they might hold. He told her about Ashfield. Not about Reo, not yet, but about the town, the work, the particular satisfaction of a life that made a clear kind of sense, and the way it felt when it stopped making that kind of sense. She told him about the healer's hall. About the smell of it, dried herbs and beeswax and old stone, and the woman who had trained her, an ancient and exacting orc elder named Vosha, who had seen something in 12-year-old Snaga that no one else had yet bothered to look for and had spent the next decade and more drawing it out. "Is Vosha still there?" he said. "Yes," Snaga said. "She was not part of the dispute. She is." She paused, and something moved across her face that was not quite grief but lived in grief's neighborhood. "She was the person I wished I could have said goodbye to." He looked at her. "I'm sorry," he said. She nodded once, receiving it without performing it, and then she picked up her bread and said, "The Greywood autumn is supposed to be spectacular. Someone told me the birch trees all turn gold at once like a fire across the hills." "They do," he said. I'll show you if you want. There's a ridge above the East Creek that gives the best view." She looked at him across the table. "All right," she said. He showed her the ridge in October, when the birches did exactly what he had promised and went gold all at once, and they stood on the ridge together in the cool air and watched the hills burn in silence, which was not the old empty silence but something full and shared and warm. He had been aware for some time of what was happening between them. He was a man who was, in most things, honest with himself. It was a habit he had developed to compensate for the fact that he often did not say what was true out loud, and if he also lied to himself, the gap between interior and exterior would become a place where bad things grew. So he knew. He knew the particular quality of his attention when she was in the room, the way the morning was better on the days he knew he would see her, the way her rare laugh still hit him in that same unprepared place every single time. He also knew, and this was the complicating part, that she had come through something that had required everything she had, and that she had landed in the Greywood wounded and alone, and rebuilt herself from raw material with no help from anyone. He did not want to be a thing that complicated that. He did not want something from her that she had not offered, or to assume that the warmth between them was the same temperature from her side as it was from his. He was also, if he was honest, and he was always honest with himself, afraid. Because the last time he had been responsible for something he loved, he had failed it. Standing on the ridge with the gold hills below them, she said, without turning to look at him, "You go very quiet sometimes, not the ordinary kind of quiet, the kind where something is happening underneath." He was surprised not that she had noticed, because she noticed everything, but that she had said it out loud. "Yes," he said. "You don't have to tell me what it is," she said. "I'm not asking." "I know you're not," he said. She turned then and looked at him, really looked, with those green eyes that had been reading him for the better part of a year, and said, "But I would listen, if you wanted to say it." He looked at the gold hills for a moment. "His name was Rel Hollies," he said. "He was my partner in Ashfield, my best friend. We had a situation, a confrontation, a man with a weapon in a crowd, and I made a decision about how to manage it, and the decision was wrong and Rel was killed." He had never said it out loud before, not to anyone. The words came out flat and clean, not because he had processed them into peace, but because he had carried them so long that they had worn smooth from handling. She was quiet. "I was responsible for him," he said. "It was my call. I got it wrong." The wind moved through the birch trees below them, a long sighing sound. "How long ago?" she said, and it was exactly the question he had asked her, the same words, the same tone. 2.5 years, he said. She nodded slowly. "You came north," she said. "I came north," he said. They stood on the ridge for a while after that, not speaking, but the silence was different now, not empty and not carefully maintained, but the kind of silence that comes after something true has been said and does not yet need anything added to it. When they started back down the ridge, she walked close enough that their arms brushed, and neither of them moved away. The winter came again and found them changed. They had not spoken about what had passed between them on the ridge, or about the brushing of arms on the way down, or about the fact that things were different now in a way that both of them knew and neither had named. But it was present in the spaces between them, warmer, less careful, more honest than it had been. He came to Millhaven more often, and when he did he stopped into the healer's building more often than not, on the basis of various pretexts that neither of them found particularly convincing. She came out to the Mercer cabin less, because the practice kept her in Millhaven most days, but she came to his land twice a week through the early winter to work the remaining trap line, and on those evenings she frequently stayed for supper, and he frequently walked her home after, and the walks grew progressively longer by the mechanism of routes that could have been shorter if either of them had been interested in shorter routes. He was chopping wood outside the cabin on a morning in late November when she rode up the lane on her wagon and stopped and looked at him with an expression that was different from usual, not alarmed, not precisely, but tighter, more interior. "What happened?" She said, a man came to the practice this morning from the southeast. He had papers, official documents from the Stonereach clan authority. He set the axe down. About you, he said. They've been tracking me, she said. The removal was apparently not enough. There are charges. She said the word with a flat precision that covered something sharp underneath. Political ones. Healer's misconduct, which is a legal construction in clan law that essentially means I treated someone I was instructed not to treat. Who did you treat? He said. A woman who was on the wrong side of the dispute, she said. As I was. She was ill. I treated her. That was apparently evidence of alliance. A pause. The man with the papers is an enforcement officer of the clan court. He cannot compel me here. This is Greywood territory, not under clan jurisdiction. But he can make a formal report and request that I be returned. Can Greywood territory honor that request? He said. If the town authority chooses to, she said. If they decide it's not worth the trouble of a dispute with the Stonereach. He looked at her. He looked at the road behind her and the empty lane and the tree line and then back at her. Millhaven has no formal authority, he said. It has Haverson, who chairs the monthly meeting, and whatever the homesteaders decide by consensus. I know, she said. Then the question is what the consensus is, he said. She looked at him carefully. James, she said, and there was a quality in his name that he had not heard from her before, something open and a little afraid. I am not asking you to fight my battles. I know, he said. But I'm going to the monthly meeting next week, and I'm going to say what I think, which is that Millhaven's healer has saved 6 lives in this community in the last 6 months, including the Cooper girl who was 2 hours from dying of fever, and that any community that turns her over to a foreign jurisdiction over a political dispute is a community I personally have no further interest in supporting with my trade or my labor or my presence. She was quiet for a long moment. That is a very significant thing to say, she said. Yes, he said. She looked at him with that complete reading look, and what she was reading now, he thought, was something that had been there for her to read for quite a while. All right, she said very quietly. He went to the monthly meeting. He said what he had said he would say. He said it in the particular quiet voice that had once carried the authority of a deputy's badge and still carried the authority of a man who meant every word precisely and was not interested in performance. He was not the only one who spoke. The Cooper family spoke. The farmer with the formerly infected wound spoke. The woman with the bandaged hand, who turned out to be the wife of one of the more resistant voices on the topic, spoke. The consensus, when it was tallied, was that Millhaven would make no response to the enforcement officer's report. The enforcement officer left the following morning. The Stonereach clan's formal request, forwarded by courier 3 weeks later, was returned with a brief note from Haverson that the Greywood Frontier recognized no external clan jurisdictions over persons legally resident in its territory. When James told Snaga, she was standing in the healer's building reorganizing her herb shelves, which she did when she was working through something. She turned and looked at him, and then she said nothing for a while. Her eyes were bright with something she was not entirely managing to contain. You put a great deal on the line, she said. It was the right thing, he said. There are people in this town who will not forgive you for it, she said. There are people in this town I can do without, he said. She looked at him across the small cluttered space of the healer's room, with the herb smell and the winter light coming through the window, and then she crossed the room to him with the same direct, purposeful economy she brought to everything, and she put her hands on either side of his face, her hands, which he knew in their skill and their warmth and their habit of tenderness, and she looked at him for a long breath. I don't know how to do this, she said, very quietly. I have been careful since the clan. I have not let myself need anyone. I know, he said, I haven't either. It frightens me, she said. Me too, he said. She kissed him. It was brief and careful and entirely deliberate, because she was always deliberate, and when she pulled back, her forehead dropped to his and they stood like that for a moment, her hands still framing his face, the winter light still falling through the window. All right, she said again, in the same tone she had used on the lane in front of his cabin when he told her he would go to the meeting. The word that meant, I am choosing this. I'm standing here and choosing this. All right, he said back in the same tone. They were slow about it because they were both people for whom slow was safer, and because it was also, as it turned out, better, the kind of deepening that comes from patience, the way a river cuts a canyon not by force but by persistence. They were not dramatic about it. They did not announce themselves to Millhaven. They did not have to. The frontier was a place where people observed each other's business as a matter of survival, and the various observers of Millhaven and the surrounding homesteads arrived at their own conclusions by the end of December without assistance. The responses varied. A few people were frankly hostile and declined to do business with James, which had been predicted and was accepted. More people were indifferent in the pragmatic way of frontier people who had more pressing concerns. A number were privately approving, and said so in the particular indirect way of people who are offering support without committing to conflict. The Cooper family brought a winter cake to the healer's building and left it without comment. Snaga received this range of responses with characteristic composure. James received it with a reserve that had more underneath it than people could read. Together, they received it as one front, which turned out to be more effective than either of them alone would have been. He moved her out of the Merker cabin and into Millhaven properly in the early spring, into the back rooms of the healer's building, which he retrofitted over 2 weekends with a small sleeping area and a proper kitchen hearth, and the best set of shelves he had built yet. She watched him put up the shelves with the particular expression that was not quite the rare laugh but was in the same family. You and your shelves, she said. I like shelves, he said. They are the most honest piece of carpentry. They do exactly what they are for, nothing more, nothing less. That is the most you have ever said about something at one time, she said. I contain depths, he said, and she laughed, the full one, the real one, the one that still hit him in the same place it always had, except that now he didn't have to look away from it. That spring was different from the one before. The one before had been about survival and practicality, and the gradual, careful construction of something like trust. This one had ease in it, the particular ease of people who have stopped pretending about what matters and started simply living it. He worked his land and she worked her practice, and they existed in the comfortable orbit of people who have found their center of gravity in each other. She began, that spring, to tell him about the scars. Not all at once. In pieces, the same way she had given him her name, cautiously, in order, testing each piece against the air before committing the next. The ones on her arms were from a ritual she had undergone at 15, the Frostwolf clan's coming-of-age marking, carried out in the old way. She described it without drama, the cold of the early morning, the smell of the fire, the elder who had done the marking telling her that the pain was temporary and the marks were permanent, and that was the point. She had stood still through it, she said, because she had always been good at standing still through things. The one on her ribs was from the confrontation that had preceded her removal from the clan, a physical altercation she described in her flat, factual way, noting the details that mattered and none that didn't. The one that ran from her jaw to her neck was from the Ashwood Pass. It had been winter. There had been ice and a fall and a distance still to travel, and she had traveled it. He listened to all of it the same way he had listened from the beginning, fully, without flinching, without the particular expressions of distress or pity that she had learned to brace for, and that she had never received from him. He did not try to fix what had happened. He did not perform outrage at the people who had done it. He simply listened, and what his listening said, what she felt in it, and what she had felt in it from the beginning, was that everything she showed him was received and held and not found wanting. On the night she told him about the Ashwood Pass, he said, after a long quiet, "You are the most purely courageous person I have ever known. I want you to know that." She was quiet for a moment. "You are the first person," she said carefully, "who has ever made me feel like my courage was for me. Not for the clan, not for a cause, not to prove something to someone, just mine. He looked at her. It is yours, he said. All of it. It has always been yours. She came to his side of the table and sat beside him, not dramatically, just the simple repositioning of two people who have decided the distance between them is unnecessarily large. And he put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and outside the Greywood spring moved through its long, unhurried evening. The loan for the healer's building was paid back in full by the end of summer, calculated to the coin and presented to him in a small leather pouch with a precision that was entirely characteristic. He held the pouch for a moment and then said, "You know you didn't have to count it to the exact coin." "I know," she said, "but I did." "Why?" he said. "Because I wanted it to be clean," she said. "I wanted everything between us to be chosen, not obligated." He looked at her. "You know I don't think of it as," he started. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm telling you, because I know you don't, and I wanted you to know that I do this for myself, so that when I stand here, I am standing here because I want to be here, not because I owe anything." He put the pouch on the table. "Snaga," he said. "James," she said, with the precise gravity she sometimes used when she was meeting him directly. "Will you stay?" he said. "Not I don't mean tonight or the season. I mean here on this land with me. Will you stay?" She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably only seconds. "Yes," she said, and it was the same quality as all right, the word of a person who is not performing or hoping or hedging, but simply stating an intention with their full weight behind it. He looked at her across the table, her green eyes, her dark hair, the tusks that had never been anything but her face, the scar that ran from her jaw to her neck that he had kissed now a dozen times, and the hands that knew how to heal things, including, he thought, the specific kind of wound that 2 years of silence had left in him. "Good," he said. They moved into the main cabin on his land at the end of summer, not hers, not his in the old sense, but theirs, which was a different thing altogether. She kept the healer's building in Millhaven, continued the practice, rode into town 4 days a week and back in the evenings. He continued the farm, expanded the south field, kept the trap line as a winter supplement. Together they were, he thought, something that worked in the way that good things worked, by being honestly what they were and asking the world to meet them there. He built more shelves. She organized them. He noticed she always left one shelf slightly less than full, which he thought was either aesthetics or the practical habit of leaving room for growth, and he did not ask which because both answers were true in their way. Autumn came again, and the birches went gold again on the ridge, and they went up together as they had gone up the year before, but this time she walked in the circle of his arm and he walked with his face turned toward her as often as toward the hills. "What are you looking at?" she said. "Better view from here," he said. She looked at him with the full weight of those green eyes and said, "You know I can see through you." "I know," he said. "I'm not trying to hide." "That is new for you," she said. "It is," he agreed. She turned back to the gold hills for a moment, and then she said in a thoughtful voice, "I want to write to Vosha." He understood what that meant, not just a letter but an opening, a willingness to reach back toward the part of her life that the clan had tried to erase. He thought of what it must cost to consider that, and what it must feel like to consider it from a place stable enough to survive the answer, whatever it might be. "I'll help you find a courier," he said. She nodded. The letter went south in October, carried by a traveling merchant who made the Ashwood route in the better seasons. The reply came in the spring 6 months later, which was the nature of distance and the pace of careful things. He was in the barn when she read it. He came in for noon meal, and found her at the table with the letter in her hands and her face doing something he had not seen before, not grief, not the composed control of someone managing grief, but actual feeling, unsuppressed, moving across her features in a way that was almost overwhelming to witness, because he had seen her be so careful for so long. He sat down beside her without speaking. She said after a while, "Vosha is well. She has a new student, a young woman, she says, who reminds her of me in her worst habits, which she says as a compliment." A pause. She says she knew I was gone before I left. She says she let me go because she trusted me to survive it. Another pause longer. She asks if I am well. Are you? He said. She looked at him and her eyes were bright. Yes, she said. Tell me something. Tell me something you have never told anyone. He looked at her, the woman who had come bleeding into a trading post and dared anyone in the room to say a word about it, who had walked 200 miles through a closed mountain pass, who had rebuilt a life from wreckage and a winter cabin with pine bark and stubbornness, who had written a letter back to the piece of herself she thought was lost. I was afraid, he said, every day in Ashfield that I would lose someone. Not because I thought about it, I barely let myself think about it, but underneath. Every day. And when I lost Reo, the thing that was the worst was not the grief, which was bad enough. It was that it was exactly what I had feared, and I had never once said so to anyone, and so nobody knew how much of that fear was mine to carry. He looked at the table. I came north to get away from it. I thought if there was no one to lose, there was no way to lose anyone. He paused. And then you showed up bleeding in Haverson's post. She took his hand on the table. I was afraid of you, she said. Not because of anything you did, because of what you were starting to mean. Because I had learned very thoroughly what it cost to be attached to a place or a people. I know, he said. I am still afraid sometimes, she said. Me too, he said. But I think he stopped. I think some fears are just the shape of caring about something. I don't think they go away. I think you just choose to stay anyway. She held his hand on the table. Yes, she said. That is exactly it. They were married that summer in the pragmatic frontier way before Haverson, who was the nearest thing Millhaven had to civic authority, with half the town watching and the other half hearing about it before the day was out. The ceremony was brief because neither of them had any patience for elaboration, but James had carved a set of matching bands from the good birch wood of the dying stand they had harvested 2 winters ago, which Snaga looked at for a long moment before she put hers on, turning it in the light. Birch, she said. From the stand, he said. It seemed right. She looked at him. It is right, she said. The Cooper family brought food. Several homesteaders came. Even a few of the people who had been uncertain or resistant showed up in the careful way of communities that have decided, slowly and without announcement, to extend their circle. Deverick Crane did not come, but he also did not make a public comment, which by his standards was practically an endorsement. That winter, the first one of their marriage, was the warmest winter James Crawford had known since coming north, not in temperature, which was brutal and reliable as always, but in the other way, the interior way, the way of a man who comes home to a fire that has been kept for him and finds the particular quality of silence in a shared space entirely different from the particular quality of silence in an empty one. She was a demanding partner in the way of people who are excellent at things and expect the same of others, which he found he did not mind because he was also demanding in his quiet way, and they were, between them, very effective. They argued about practical things, the crop rotation, the best approach to the new section of the South Field, whether the horse deserved the extra grain she was giving him, in the direct way of people who fight cleanly and reconcile quickly, because neither of them holds grievances as a habit. She had no patience for his tendency to understate his own physical condition, which expressed itself as turning up to breakfast with a bandaged hand, and saying it was fine before she had even finished the question. He had no patience for her tendency to work 18 hours and then be surprised that she was tired. They managed these things between them with the particular intimacy of 2 people who have learned each other's vulnerabilities and chosen to take care of them, whether or not the other person is cooperating. By the following autumn, she was carrying their first child. She told him about it in the evenings, matter-of-factly, in the way she told him most things directly and as soon as she was certain. He looked at her across the room for a moment, and then he crossed it to her and held her face in his hands the way she had held his face in the healer's room, and she looked up at him with those green eyes that missed nothing. "Are you all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" He thought about it honestly, the way he always tried to be honest with himself. "I'm terrified," he said. and I cannot imagine anything I want more." "Good," she said. "That is the right amount of feeling about it." He laughed, and she looked satisfied with herself in the way she occasionally permitted, and outside the Greywood autumn moved through its slow gold decline. The boy was born in late spring, in the healer's building in Millhaven, delivered by Snaga herself in the most concentrated exercise of professional focus James had ever witnessed, which was saying something, because he had seen her work under considerable pressure before. He was present for the whole of it, at her instruction. She wanted him there, she said, and also she wanted someone to hand her things accurately, which she was not confident the midwife from the south end of the settlement could do with sufficient precision. The boy was born healthy and loud, with James's dark hair and Snaga's green complexion and the beginning of what would become his mother's tusks, small and milk-pale and already present in the curve of his jaw. He had James's eyes, the particular still, gray-blue of a man who watches before he speaks, and Snaga's hands, long-fingered and deliberate. They named him Hollies. James had not suggested the name. He had thought about it privately, turning it over in the quiet of a night when Snaga was sleeping, and the baby was new, and the world was very large and very small all at once. He had thought about Rel Hollies, his best friend, 6 years of his life, a man who had deserved better than he had gotten, and he had thought that the carrying of a name forward was not the same as the carrying of guilt forward, and that one of them should go and the other could, maybe, if he chose it, go too. He had not said any of this aloud. But in the morning, when Snaga asked him what he thought, he had said, "Hollies," and she had looked at him with the reading look, knowing, he thought, at least some of the geography, and said, "Yes." Hollies Crawford grew up on the Greywood Frontier with a healer for a mother and a farmer-trapper former deputy for a father, which was an education in itself. He grew up half-orc and half-human in a world that did not always know what to do with the compound, and he grew up seeing, every day, two people who had found each other across a distance that was not only geography and had chosen to stay, which was its own kind of education. He was 3 when Snaga delivered his sister, a girl, born in the main cabin this time, since the healer's building was well established enough to run itself for a day without her. The girl had Snaga's coloring, more fully greener-skinned, with her mother's green eyes and the same dark hair, and a quality of intense, examining stillness that her mother recognized immediately, and her father received with the particular composed affection of a man who knew what that stillness contained. They named her Vosha. The letter to the elder had continued through the years back and forth, twice annually, carried on the Ashwood route by the same merchant who had carried the first one, and who had, over time, become something like a friend by the simple mechanism of being trusted with important things. The elder Vosha wrote in the careful, precise hand of a woman who valued accuracy, and her letters were always practical and occasionally, in a single sentence embedded in the middle of a longer paragraph, something that broke Snaga open in the way that only old love and old knowing could. Snaga kept the letters in a wooden box on the shelf with the birch frame that held their marriage bands when they weren't wearing them. James knew the box was there. He did not read the letters because they were hers. But sometimes, when she was working through something, she took the box down and held it in her lap without opening it, and he understood that to be its own kind of reading, the knowing of what a thing contained without needing to take it out. He had his own things he kept. The deputy's badge from Ashfield, which he had brought north without knowing why, and had kept without knowing why, and which he understood now as a different kind of letter to a different kind of loss, not guilt any more, or not only guilt but memory, and the difference between them was the most important distance he had ever crossed. When Hollies was 6, he asked about the badge. James got it down from its place on the shelf and put it in his son's hands and told him about Ashfield and about being a deputy and about a man named Rel Hollies who had been his best friend. He did not keep any of it back. Hollies listened with his mother's green eyes and his father's stillness, turning the badge over in his small hands. "Was it your fault?" Hollies asked, with the directness of a child who has grown up among people who value directness. "Yes and no," James said. "I made a bad decision, but bad decisions are not always the same as fault. I have spent a long time learning the difference." "Does it still hurt?" Holly said. "Yes," James said, "less than it did. The kind of hurt that means you loved someone. That kind doesn't go away, and I've decided I don't want it to." Holly's handed back the badge and thought about that for a while. Then he said, "Mama has scars from things that hurt too." "She does," James said. "She never talks about them," Holly said. "She talks about them to me," James said. "Some things you choose who you tell, that's all right. It doesn't mean the hurt isn't real. It means you decide who you trust with it." Holly's looked at the shelf where the badge went back. "Who do I tell things to?" he said. "You can tell me," James said. "Or your mother, or both, or no one for a while until you're ready. You'll learn who your people are." He looked at his son. "Everyone does eventually." Holly's nodded slowly, with that particular thoughtful composure that sat oddly on a 6-year-old, and that Snaga, who had come in from the kitchen and was listening from the doorway, received with a private expression James caught from the corner of his eye. That evening, after the children were in the loft, Snaga sat with him by the fire and said, "You told him well." "Did I?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I should tell them more eventually, about the clan, about what happened, so they understand where they come from." "When you're ready," he said. "I know when I'm ready. I'm telling you I intend to." "I know," he said. "I believe you." She leaned into his side and looked at the fire. "When I walked into Haverson's post that day," she said, "I had been in the Greywood for 9 days. I did not know a single person within 100 miles. I had a wound in my side and 12 coins in my pocket, and I was so cold I could not feel my hands properly." He looked at her. "I have thought about that day many times," she said. "What would have happened if the road had been different? If I had gone to the post a different day, if you had not been there?" "I was there," he said. "You were there," she said. "And you did not ask for anything, you just helped." He was quiet. "I did not know how to receive that," she said. "I kept waiting for the price. There is always a price on the frontier. For an orc woman there is always a price, but you never named one." "There wasn't one," he said. "I know that now," she said. "It took me a long time to know it truly. Not just to believe it because I wanted to, but to know it the way you know something that has been tested and held." He put his arm around her and she leaned in. "I had a silence in me," he said, "when I came north, a particular kind of silence, the kind that comes from losing something and not being able to say it to anyone." "I know," she said. "I had one too." "They matched," he said. She looked up at him. "They matched," she said. "Two silences, and between them something that filled them." She paused. "I did not expect that to be possible. I had decided by the time I walked into that post that I was a person who would live alone and work hard and not need anything from anyone." "How is that working out?" he said. She looked at him with the full weight of her green eyes, and then she smiled, not the rare, partial smile of the early years, but the full one, unguarded and unhurried, the one that had taken up permanent residence somewhere around the 2nd year and never really left. "Badly," she said. "Completely, irredeemably badly." He laughed, and she laughed, and outside the Greywood winter settled in around their cabin with the patient permanence of something that knows it is not going anywhere, and the fire burned warm against the walls that had been built to hold the cold out and had held, through every season, exactly as they were built to do. Vosha came north in the 7th year. She came in the summer, carried by the same merchant route that had carried the letters, and she arrived at Millhaven on a warm June morning, looking exactly as Snaga had described her, ancient, exacting, and possessed of a quality of absolute presence that made the air around her feel different. She stood in the street and looked at the healer's building, with its clean-painted sign, Snaga Crawford, healer, and the row of herb pots along the window ledge, and the door propped open on the summer morning. She stood there for a moment, and then she looked down the street to where Snaga had come out of the cooper's shop and stopped, still as water, seeing her. James was standing near the hitching post outside Haverson's place, and he watched from there. He watched Snaga walk toward the old woman, and watched the old woman watch her come, and watched the moment when they reached each other, and the elder's hands came up to frame Snaga's face the way Snaga had once framed James's and the way James still did when he wanted her to know she was seen. He walked to the grain merchants, collected his order, loaded the wagon, and gave them an hour. When he came back, they were sitting inside the healer's building with tea, and Snaga looked different. Not wounded, not healed, but different in the way that a piece of something that had been held separate from the whole is finally returned to its right place. Full somehow. Complete. He came in and Vosha looked at him with eyes that were aged and exact and missed nothing. "This is James," Snaga said, in a voice he had not heard from her before, softer than usual, the voice she used with the children sometimes and in the dark and never in front of anyone else. Vosha looked at him for a long time. "Yes," the elder said, as if confirming something she had already known from the letters. "I see," he said. "It's an honor to meet you." Vosha said, "She wrote to me about a man who helped her and asked for nothing. I told her that men who ask for nothing are either saints or very patient." She looked at him. "Which are you?" "Very patient," he said. Vosha made a sound that was her version of a laugh. Vosha stayed 3 weeks. She spent them doing the things that mattered, talking with Snaga in the evenings, working in the healer's building in the days, sitting with Hollies and young Vosha, for whom she had a quality of attention that recognized itself in its namesake. James watched all of it from the appropriate distance, giving them the space that was theirs, and occasionally being called into it when it was his to enter. On the last evening before she left, Vosha came and sat with him on the porch of the main cabin while Snaga was inside putting the children to bed. She said, "The scars on her arms, do you know what they mean?" "I know they are the Frostwolf marking," he said, "the coming of age. They mark the transition from a person who belongs to the clan to a person who belongs to herself," Vosha said. "That is the old meaning, though many have forgotten it. The clan uses it now to mean belonging to the clan, which is not the same thing. But the old meaning is the true one." She looked out at the Greywood. Snaga always understood the true meaning. It is one of the reasons she could not stay. He was quiet. "And the scar on her neck," Vosha said, "the Ashwood Pass." "Yes," he said. "She walked 2 days on a broken ankle to get through that pass," Vosha said. "She did not tell you that." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "she didn't. She would not tell you herself because she does not think of it as exceptional," Vosha said. "She thinks of it as what was necessary." The elder looked at him. "But I want you to know, because the person who loves someone should know the full measure of who they love." He looked at the tree line. "Thank you," he said. Vosha left in the morning, and Snaga stood in the road and watched the wagon go until it turned at the birch line and disappeared. And then she stood there for another moment before James came and stood beside her. She took his hand without looking at him. They stood there together until the road was empty and the Greywood morning had moved on into itself, full and green and unhurried. Years went on the way years do, not in a line but in layers, each one adding depth to the one beneath it. The children grew. Hollies became a serious, quiet boy with his mother's precision and his father's steadiness. And at 12, he began helping in the healer's building with a competence that made Snaga start using the word apprentice in the particular precise way she used words when she meant them fully. Vosha, the daughter, became something else entirely, bold and loud and physical, with a joy in the world that neither of her parents had managed in their early years, but that both of them recognized as something the other had given her. The farm expanded and contracted through good years and hard ones. The healer's practice grew until Snaga was training 2 assistants. There was a second building beside the first now, for the dispensary, built by James over 2 winters to her exact specifications, which included the shelves, which he built to the same standard as always. There was a hard year when the Greywood had a season of floods and then drought, and the crops failed in 3/4 of the settlements. And James and Snaga gave from their stores freely because they could. and because the community had given them things over the years that could not be stored or counted. There was a sickness that moved through the settlement 2 years after that, not the killing kind, but close, and Snaga worked for 3 weeks without sufficient sleep. And James brought her food and watched her work and held her when it was finally over with the total, encompassing hold of a man who has been afraid for 3 weeks and is finally not afraid. When Hollis was 18, he went south to train formally at the Healers College in Ashfield, the human institution, not the clan, because he was both and chose both, and his mother had trained him well enough that the college accepted him without question. When he left, James walked him to the road and said everything there was to say in the particular economical way of men who have learned that saying the right things once is more than enough. Hollis hugged him, which was something the boy had always been better at than his father, and James held on for longer than usual. Snaga watched from the porch. When James came back, she said, "He will be fine." "I know," James said. "You know he will," she said, "but you are still afraid." "Yes," he said. "That is what I said a long time ago, that some fears are just the shape of loving someone." She looked at him. "You did say that," she said. "It's still true," he said. She took his face in her hands as she had in the healer's room, as she still sometimes did, in the particular way that meant she was looking at the whole of him and not the surface, and he looked back at her. They were 40 now, both of them within a year. The life they had was written in their faces, and their hands the weather and the work and the children and the years, the grief they had carried in separately and had learned to carry together, the silences that had become so full of shared meaning that they were barely silences anymore. She had gray at her temples, the orc gray that came in silver white and stark against the dark, and he had lines at his eyes and his jaw that were entirely earned. She was still the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Not despite the years, but because of them, because he knew exactly what each year had contained and what it had cost and what it had given, and the woman standing in front of him was the sum of all of it, and all of it was good. "James Crawford," she said. "Snaga Crawford," he said. She smiled, the full one, the permanent one. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That I am very glad I was in Haverson's Post that day," he said. She laughed. "That is the most sentimental thing you have ever said," she said. "I have depths," he said. "I know," she said. "I have been exploring them for 12 years. He kissed her, not briefly this time, not with the care of something new and uncertain, but with the ease and the warmth and the full, unhurried certainty of 12 years choosing. And outside, the Greywood was doing what the Greywood always did, turning and breathing in its own ancient way, paying no particular attention to the small human and orc heart of things that had taken root in its frontier soil. But the frontier noticed. The frontier remembered, in the way places remember things, in the worn path between the main cabin and the healer's building in Millhaven, in the shelves inside that building still perfectly level after a decade, in the trap line along the East Creek that neither of them ran anymore, but that the next generation of homesteaders had taken up by example, in the way Millhaven had grown from a dozen buildings, and a stubborn question about who belonged to something larger and quieter and more certain, in the way a healer's sign read a name that had 2 histories and 1 life in it, in the way 2 wooden rings sat on a shelf in a birch frame, worn smooth from being worn, in the way a box of letters sat beside them and a deputy's badge sat on the shelf above, and together they were not monuments to pain, but to what pain, if you survived it, could eventually make room for. In the way a man who had come north with a silence full of grief, and a woman who had come north with scars she had carried alone, had found each other in a trading post on a gray autumn day, and had slowly, honestly, with all the difficulty and all the grace of 2 people who had learned the hard way to be afraid of needing anything, built something so solid it would last long past both of them. Something that their children carried forward, half human and half orc, into a world that had not yet finished deciding what it thought about that, and that went forward into it anyway with the particular courage that was not heroic or theatrical, but simply the willingness to keep choosing, every day, the life that was true. The scars she had never explained, she had explained. Not to the world, not as a justification, not as a price of admission, but to the one person she had decided could hold them, who had held them, who would always hold them. The silences he had never filled, he had filled. Not with noise, not with performance, not with the effortful busyness of a man running from himself, but with the slow, honest weight of shared living, of a life large enough to contain grief and become, eventually, more than grief. Somehow, that had made them the same. Somehow, it had made them something better than either alone. And in the Greywood, in the long gold of another autumn, the birch trees did what they always did, turned all at once, like a fire across the hills, and burned beautifully against the gray sky, and did not apologize for the fullness of it. Neither did they.